I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway. The usual shade that covered my front yard was gone. Instead, the midday sun blazed down on my property like a spotlight, exposing the raw, uneven stumps where my oak trees had stood for over 20 years. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I stepped out of my car, my breath slow and controlled. Someone had cut down my trees. Not just any trees, these were towering oaks, each one older than most of the houses in the neighborhood. They weren't just decorations, they were a part of my home, part of why I had bought this property in the first place. And now they were gone. I didn't need to guess who was responsible. Before I could even make it to my porch, I heard the sharp, smug voice of Bernadette Fischer, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood and the head of the HOA. She was standing near the curb, arms crossed over her chest, a satisfied expression on her face. "Ah, Nathaniel Ziegler," she said in that condescending tone she always used. "I see you've finally noticed." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Bernadette, tell me you didn't do this." Her lips curled into something resembling a smile. "Oh, we absolutely did. Those trees were against HOA regulations. They were an eyesore and, frankly, a safety hazard. We had no choice but to remove them." I felt a slow burn of anger rising in my chest. "You had no choice. Those trees were on my property. You had no right to touch them." Bernadette waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, Nathaniel, you really should read the fine print of the HOA bylaws. We have the authority to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and that includes removing problematic landscaping." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You trespassed onto my property and destroyed my trees. That's not maintaining aesthetics, that's illegal." Bernadette scoffed. "Oh, please, you're being dramatic. If you want to replace them, I'm sure you can plant some nice HOA-approved shrubs instead, something more appropriate for the neighborhood." I clenched my jaw. "You don't know what you just did." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't start with the threats. That wasn't a threat," I interrupted. "It's a fact. You broke the law, Bernadette." She let out a short laugh, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. It's just some trees." I took a step back, my mind already working. "You'll be hearing from me soon, and Bernadette, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Bernadette scoffed again, clearly unimpressed, but I didn't stick around to argue. I had work to do. Because what Bernadette clearly didn't know was that I wasn't just some homeowner she could bully into submission. I was the local prosecutor, and I was about to make her regret ever touching my trees. I didn't waste time. The moment I stepped inside my house, I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, I contacted the city's zoning and environmental department. If Bernadette thought she could get away with this, she was about to learn otherwise. The official I spoke with, a man named Alan Torres, didn't take long to confirm what I already suspected. My trees had been protected under local ordinances, and any removal required explicit permission from both the homeowner and the city. Without it, the penalty was steep. "How many trees did you say were removed?" Alan asked, his tone shifting from professional to serious. "3 mature oaks," I replied. There was a pause before Alan let out a low whistle. "That's bad. Not only are those considered heritage trees in this area, but I'm guessing they were over a certain diameter." "Easily," I said. "Each trunk was at least 2 feet wide." Alan exhaled. "That puts this in felony territory. Destruction of protected vegetation without a permit carries major fines, and if the HOA was involved, they could be looking at civil and criminal liability." I gritted my teeth. "Good, I want to file an official report." Alan didn't hesitate. "I'll send an inspector out first thing tomorrow." "Do you have any documentation, pictures, property surveys?" "I have everything," I assured him, "and I'm going to make sure this gets handled properly." After hanging up, I moved on to my next task. I pulled up my home security footage. My cameras covered my entire front yard, and sure enough, I found exactly what I was looking for. The footage showed a group of workers arriving early that morning. They were accompanied by a man in a cheap suit, clipboard in hand, someone I recognized as Richard Haverson, the HOA's so-called compliance officer. He stood off to the side, giving orders while the crew revved up their chainsaws. Then there was Bernadette. She arrived halfway through the job, standing with her usual air of self-importance as she watched my trees being taken down. At one point, she even gestured toward my house, saying something to Richard. He nodded, scribbled something down, and continued overseeing the destruction. They knew exactly what they were doing. I copied the footage onto a flash drive, then took detailed photos of the stumps in my yard. By the time I was done, I had an ironclad case. That evening, I paid a visit to my neighbor, James Holloway. He had lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone and had been at odds with the HOA for years. He was a retired contractor, a no-nonsense man who didn't tolerate fools. The moment he opened the door, he gave me a knowing look. Saw what happened to your trees. HOA's getting bolder, huh? They're getting reckless, I corrected, and I'm going to make sure they regret it. James nodded, stepping aside to let me in. You need anything from me? I need to know if they had permission, I said. They claim it was an HOA decision, but that doesn't mean they followed the rules. James snorted. They never do. I can tell you right now, they didn't get any approval from the city. HOA thinks they run this place like a private kingdom. I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage. He watched in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Unbelievable, he muttered. They didn't even try to hide it. They didn't think they had to, I replied, but they just made a serious mistake. James leaned back, crossing his arms. So what's the plan? I've already contacted the city, I said. An inspector is coming tomorrow and I'm filing charges, but I also want to hit them in a way they won't see coming. James raised an eyebrow. You thinking lawsuit? Not just a lawsuit, I said. I want to go after their authority. The HOA has been overstepping for years and people are sick of it. If we can prove they've been operating outside their legal limits, we can get their power stripped. James grinned. Now that sounds like a plan. By the next morning, the inspector arrived right on time. Alan Torres stepped out of his city-issued vehicle, clipboard in hand, and took one look at the remains of my trees before shaking his head. This is bad, he said. Really bad. He took his time documenting everything, measuring the stumps, taking soil samples, and snapping photos from every angle. Once he was done, he turned to me. I'll be filing an official report with the city. The HOA is in clear violation of multiple ordinances, and given the size of these trees, the fines alone could be in the tens of thousands. Good, I said firmly. I also want to press charges for trespassing and property destruction. Alan nodded. You'll need to file that with the police. But with this evidence, they'll have a strong case. That was all I needed to hear. By the afternoon, I was sitting across from Detective Lisa Brennan at the local precinct. She listened carefully as I laid everything out, her expression growing more and more displeased. That's blatant criminal damage, she said. And if they entered your property without consent, that's trespassing on top of it. I handed her the flash drive. Security footage, timestamps, and clear identification of the culprits. Lisa inserted the drive into her laptop, watching the footage with narrowed eyes. When she saw Bernadette giving orders, she let out a low whistle. She's got no plausible deniability, Lisa said. This is enough to bring charges, I leaned back. Then let's make it happen. By the time I left the precinct, Bernadette and her cronies had no idea that the walls were closing in, but they were about to find out. Nathaniel had spent years in courtrooms, unraveling cases with methodical precision. This wasn't just another legal battle, it was personal. And now, with evidence stacked against Bernadette and her lackeys, it was time to press forward. The first order of business was the police report. Detective Lisa Brennan wasted no time. By the time Nathaniel left the precinct that evening, she had already put in the paperwork to issue formal charges: trespassing, vandalism, criminal mischief, felony destruction of protected trees. The HOA board wasn't just looking at fines, they were staring down real consequences. The next morning, news traveled fast. James Holloway called Nathaniel before he even had a chance to finish his coffee. They're panicking, James said. Bernadette just had an emergency board meeting. Word is, they're trying to figure out how to spin this before it gets worse. Nathaniel wasn't surprised. He had dealt with criminals long enough to know that the moment they realized they were caught, they scrambled to cover their tracks. But this wasn't something they could brush under the rug. By mid-afternoon, the city inspector's official report was released. It confirmed everything Nathaniel already knew: the tree removal was illegal, HOA authorization was invalid, and the damages were extensive. The fines alone were enough to cripple the association's budget. Then came the letter from the city's legal department. The HOA had violated multiple municipal codes, and the city was now considering revoking parts of their governing authority. That was the real blow. Without their broad enforcement powers, the HOA would be reduced to little more than a glorified neighborhood committee. Nathaniel knew Bernadette wouldn't go down quietly. By that evening, she was at his doorstep. He opened the door to find her standing there, arms crossed, trying to maintain the composure of someone who wasn't on the verge of losing everything. "We need to talk," she said. Nathaniel stepped outside, his arms resting at his sides. "No, Bernadette. You need to listen." She pressed her lips together. "This has gotten out of hand." "You mean you've lost control," Nathaniel corrected. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. That's over now." She exhaled sharply. "This doesn't have to escalate any further. We can work something out privately." Nathaniel studied her. She was desperate, but she still thought she had a way out. He wasn't about to let that happen. "There's nothing to work out," he said. "You're being held accountable." "That's how the law works." Her mask cracked, her voice growing sharper. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No, you did that when you trespassed on my property and destroyed my trees. You broke the law, Bernadette. And now you're facing the consequences." She glanced toward the street, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "If you drop this, I'll make sure the HOA compensates you for the trees. We can call it even." Nathaniel let out a short laugh. "You think I'm after money? This isn't about a payout. This is about stopping you from abusing your power." Her frustration boiled over. "You don't understand what you're doing to this community. If the HOA loses authority, this neighborhood will fall apart." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "No, it'll finally be free from your control." Bernadette's jaw clenched. For the first time, she seemed to realize there was no bargaining her way out. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Nathaniel knew she wouldn't give up that easily. The real fight was just beginning. The next morning, the fallout escalated. The HOA board scrambled to hold an emergency meeting, but it wasn't just their usual circle of enforcers. Half the neighborhood showed up. James had spread the word. People were furious. Many of them had been steamrolled by the HOA before, hit with ridiculous fines, forced to comply with arbitrary rules. Now that they saw the association had finally been caught breaking the law, they wanted justice. Nathaniel stood at the back of the room, watching as the meeting unraveled. Bernadette sat at the head of the table, trying to maintain order, but the crowd wasn't having it. A woman near the front, Maria, a longtime resident, stood up. "You think you can just destroy someone's property and face no consequences?" Bernadette held up a hand. "The board acted in accordance with neighborhood guidelines," James cut her off. "No, you didn't. You acted like a dictator and now you're paying for it." Another resident spoke up. "If you think we're going to keep paying HOA dues just for you to pull stunts like this, you're out of your mind." Nathaniel stepped forward. "The city is already taking action. The police are involved. The HOA's authority is under review, and if enough people push back, this organization could lose its power for good." That sent a ripple through the crowd. Bernadette looked around, realizing she was losing control. "This is a coordinated attack against the HOA," she snapped. "If you let this happen, we'll lose everything we've built." Nathaniel met her gaze. "What you built was a system that let you exploit homeowners. That ends now." The room erupted into arguments, some still clinging to the HOA's rules, but most demanding change. Nathaniel knew this was only the beginning. The legal battle would take time. The city's review of the HOA's authority would be a slow process, but the momentum had shifted. Bernadette and her board had ruled unchecked for too long. Now, they were facing something they had never encountered before: resistance. And Nathaniel wasn't going anywhere until justice was served. Nathaniel watched as the meeting unraveled into chaos. The HOA board was surrounded by angry homeowners, their voices rising in frustration. Bernadette was trying to maintain control, but her usual air of authority was slipping fast. James leaned toward Nathaniel, lowering his voice. You see that? She's losing them. They're not scared of her anymore. Nathaniel nodded. Good. That means they're ready to fight back. Bernadette slammed her gavel against the table, her voice sharp. Enough, this meeting will be conducted in an orderly manner. A man in the crowd, someone Nathaniel recognized as a longtime resident named Arthur, folded his arms. Orderly. You trespassed on private property and destroyed protected trees. That's not order, that's criminal. Bernadette's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but the usual HOA loyalists were silent. Even Richard Haverson, the so-called compliance officer who had overseen the illegal tree removal, seemed uneasy. Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. The city is already involved. The police are investigating, and now the residents are demanding accountability. You don't have control over this anymore, Bernadette. She clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply. This association has functioned for years because of rules. If we, Maria, cut her off. Rules or your personal power trip. You don't get to bulldoze people's property and expect us to just accept it. James added, you've been pushing people around for years, handing out bogus fines, making up rules as you go. Now that you've finally gone too far, you want to talk about order. Bernadette's face darkened. If this HOA loses its authority, don't come crying to me when property values plummet. Nathaniel didn't let her diversion go unanswered. The only thing hurting this neighborhood's value is your abuse of power. The city's already looking into restricting the HOA's authority. And if enough residents vote against you, this board won't exist anymore. A murmur spread through the crowd. The idea of dismantling the HOA entirely had never seemed like a possibility until now. Bernadette's fingers clenched around the gavel. You're all making a mistake. No one looked convinced. Nathaniel scanned the room and saw the shift in people's expressions. They weren't just angry, they were determined. James turned toward the group. Who here wants to put this to a vote? Let's decide once and for all if this HOA should keep its power. Hands shot up around the room. Bernadette's face paled. Nathaniel locked eyes with her. You wanted control. Now you'll see what happens when the people take it back. Bernadette pushed herself up from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor. This meeting is adjourned. No one moved. Maria crossed her arms. You don't get to decide that anymore. Nathaniel saw it then, the fear in Bernadette's eyes. She had ruled this neighborhood through intimidation, but now the people weren't afraid anymore. James turned to Nathaniel. We should set up a formal petition. If enough people sign it, we can force a vote. Nathaniel nodded. I'll handle the legal side. You get people organized. The meeting ended not with Bernadette's usual show of dominance, but with residents gathering in small groups, discussing their next steps. The balance of power had shifted. As Nathaniel left the community center, James walked beside him. You think she'll try to retaliate? Nathaniel kept his gaze forward. She's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. James let out a low chuckle. Then let's make sure she keeps making them. The next morning, Nathaniel woke to an email from Detective Lisa Brennan. The investigation was moving faster than expected. The city had reviewed the security footage, and arrest warrants were being prepared for Bernadette and Richard Haverson. Nathaniel smirked to himself. They had been so confident in their power that they didn't even try to cover their tracks. Before heading to work, he stopped by James' house. The older man was already outside, speaking with a few other neighbors. When he saw Nathaniel approaching, he waved him over. You're just in time, James said. We've got over 50 signatures already. People are ready to take this HOA down. Nathaniel nodded approvingly. Good, keep pushing. The city's moving fast. Arrest warrants are coming. James let out a low whistle. That's going to make waves. Nathaniel's phone buzzed, a message from Lisa. They're making the arrests today, Nathaniel said. James grinned. I hope I get a front row seat. By noon, Bernadette's downfall was official. Police cars arrived at her house, red and blue lights flashing. The neighborhood gathered, watching as officers knocked on her door. Nathaniel stood near the sidewalk, arms crossed as Bernadette stepped outside, her face pale. The officer in charge read her the charges: trespassing, destruction of property, violating city ordinances. Her gaze locked onto Nathaniel. You did this. Nathaniel didn't blink. "No, Bernadette, you did this to yourself." Richard Haverson was arrested shortly after. The HOA's so-called compliance officer had no defense. By the time the police cars drove away, the neighborhood had erupted into conversation. Maria turned to Nathaniel. "So what happens now?" Nathaniel looked at the petition in James' hands. "Now we finish what we started." The following week, the votes were counted. The residents had spoken. The HOA was dissolved. Bernadette had ruled the neighborhood for years through intimidation and manipulation. But in the end, her own arrogance had been her undoing. Nathaniel stepped onto his porch, looking at the fresh oak saplings he had planted where his trees once stood. They would grow again, stronger than before. Just like the neighborhood, Nathaniel stood on his front porch, watching as the last remains of the uprooted HOA crumbled. The neighborhood was buzzing, but this time it wasn't with fear or frustration. People were really talking for the first time in years. Without Bernadette's looming presence, it was as if a weight had been lifted. James walked up the driveway, holding a cup of coffee like it was a trophy. He extended it toward Nathaniel, who took it with a nod. "She's gone," James said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had waited for this moment for far too long. Nathaniel took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth settle. "Not just her. The whole system she built." James gestured toward the small group of neighbors gathered near the sidewalk. "People are already talking about what comes next. Some want to keep some kind of neighborhood committee, but one that actually works for the people instead of controlling them." Nathaniel considered it. "That could work, as long as it has actual oversight and no unchecked power." James chuckled. "That's why they want you involved." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Me," James nodded. "You took down the HOA, people trust you, and they know you won't let something like this happen again." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. He had moved into this neighborhood for peace, not politics. But after everything that had happened, after seeing firsthand what unchecked authority could do, he wasn't sure he could walk away from it. Before he could respond, a car pulled up across the street. A city official stepped out, dressed in a crisp suit, holding a folder under one arm. Alan Torres, the inspector who had first confirmed the HOA's violations, approached with a purposeful stride. Nathaniel met him halfway down the driveway. "Didn't expect to see you here today." Alan tapped the folder. "Had to make a visit. Wanted to personally deliver the city's final decision." James folded his arms. "I take it it's something good." Alan opened the folder and handed Nathaniel a document. The HOA's authority to enforce fines, manage properties, and dictate neighborhood regulations has been officially revoked. They no longer have any legal standing. Nathaniel scanned the document, every line confirming what they had fought for. The HOA was no longer an entity with power. It was just a name on old paperwork, soon to be forgotten. James let out a satisfied huff. "Well, that's one for the books." Alan wasn't finished. "There's more. The city reviewed the financial records we received from the police investigation. Turns out Bernadette and her board had been misusing HOA funds for years. They funneled money into personal expenses, fabricated fines to pad their budget, and even rerouted maintenance funds into private accounts." Nathaniel's grip on the paper tightened. He had suspected corruption, but this was worse than he imagined. "How much are we talking?" Alan shook his head. "Over $200,000 in misappropriated funds." James let out a low whistle. "That explains why we never saw improvements around here." Alan continued. "The city's pressing charges for fraud, theft, and embezzlement. Bernadette's facing serious time. And given how deep this runs, she won't be the only one." Nathaniel nodded. "Good. Every single one of them should be held accountable." Alan checked his watch. "I need to head back and file some paperwork, but I thought you'd want to know." Nathaniel shook his hand. "Thanks for everything." As Alan left, James turned to Nathaniel. "So, what now?" Nathaniel glanced at the group of neighbors still talking, already discussing possibilities for the future. He had spent so much time fighting against the HOA that he hadn't thought about what came next. But now, looking at his yard, the roots of new trees settling into the soil, he realized something. They weren't just rebuilding their neighborhood. They were making sure no one like Bernadette would ever have power over them again. And that was worth sticking around for. Nathaniel watched the neighborhood transform over the next few weeks. Without the HOA lording over everyone, the atmosphere changed. People no longer hesitated to repaint their shutters a different color or plant flowers that didn't conform to the association's outdated guidelines. Conversations that used to be whispered in frustration now filled the streets with laughter and relief. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Bernadette's fraudulent activities had sealed her fate, and the city wasted no time pressing charges. Richard Haverson and several board members who had profited from the HOA's corruption were also under investigation. The court filings detailed their extensive misuse of funds, and the community was hungry for justice. James approached Nathaniel one afternoon while he was replacing the mailbox that had once been deemed non-compliant by the HOA. He handed him a thick envelope. The signatures for the dissolution vote had been certified. The HOA was officially dead. Nathaniel flipped through the pages, nodding in satisfaction before setting them aside. He leaned on his shovel, wiping the sweat from his forehead. James crossed his arms, glancing down the street where a group of kids rode their bikes freely, something they never did before, fearing the HOA's complaints about unsupervised children on public property. Nathaniel said the words they both had been waiting to hear. The neighborhood was truly theirs again. Just when it seemed like things were settling, a lawyer representing the remnants of the HOA board sent out a final desperate letter. The remaining members, those who hadn't been arrested, attempted to file a countersuit against the city, claiming that the dissolution of the HOA was unlawful. Nathaniel read the letter, shaking his head at their audacity. He walked over to James' house, holding it up between two fingers. James read through it and let out a dry laugh. They both knew this was a feeble attempt to claw back control. The letter was full of vague legal claims, but nothing held any real weight. The HOA had no legal authority anymore, and no court would side with them. Nathaniel decided to address it head-on. He reached out to the city's legal team, forwarding them the letter. The response was swift and decisive. The city would not entertain any attempt to reinstate the corrupt organization. The HOA had operated outside its legal bounds for too long, and no amount of legal maneuvering would bring it back. A week later, news broke that Bernadette had agreed to a plea deal. She faced overwhelming evidence, and her legal team had advised her that fighting the case would only result in a worse outcome. Her plea included full restitution of the stolen funds, which meant the money would be returned to the residents who had been wrongfully fined over the years. James walked over to Nathaniel's house that evening, handing him a beer as they stood on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the houses. James brought up the idea of what came next. With the HOA gone, decisions about neighborhood upkeep and events would now fall to the residents themselves. Some wanted a voluntary community organization, one with actual accountability and no power to impose fines. Nathaniel considered it. The idea of a group that actually worked for the people, rather than against them, was appealing, but it would need the right leadership. People who cared about the neighborhood, not about control. James nudged him, mentioning that a lot of folks wanted Nathaniel to take the lead. Nathaniel exhaled, contemplating. He had taken down the HOA because it was the right thing to do, but stepping into a leadership role wasn't something he had planned. Still, looking around at the houses, at the people who had fought alongside him, he realized something. The battle wasn't just about tearing down corruption. It was about making sure it never returned. He told James he'd think about it. A few days later, the last remnants of the HOA were officially dismantled. The bank accounts were drained to repay the residents, the bylaws were permanently voided, and the remaining board members resigned in disgrace. Nathaniel stood in his yard, looking at the saplings he had planted where his old oaks once stood. They weren't as tall yet, but they would grow. Stronger than before, just like the neighborhood.